Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll get started. Welcome weekly session, a weekly huddle. I am Dr. Praneeth Puri. I'm joined with my colleague, Dr. Anup Agarwal, who is also an interventional cardiologist working with me. Weekly huddle, most of you know, is an audience level interactive session where we discuss a variety of things, mostly focused on. So the idea of the huddle is to pick up one topic or a clinical case and try to restrict our discussion around that case. And with that discussion, we bring out something which we normally do in our corridors or canteen or consultation room. So the basic premise of huddle is to bring out those casual discussions to a more generalized, organized platform like this and share our ideas. So we want to discuss and talk about science, and essentially the huddle aims to bring out the practice patterns and understand the direction of particular decision. Huddle is hosted every Wednesday between 7:30 to 8:30. Today is the 28th session, and today we are discussing about drug-induced coagulopathy and its management issues. So most of already prescribed anticoagulants to our patients, and I'm sure most of them have encountered patients having coagulopathy. So today we are going to discuss about this thing. So today we are kind of reversing our roles. So we start the clinical discussion with my co-host Anup, and then we'll follow it up with the participants here. So Anup, I'll describe the case to you, and we'll take your thoughts, and then we will move it forward. So this patient is a 60-year-old female who had a chronic rheumatic heart disease for which she underwent a mitral valve replacement with a mechanical valve. She also has atrial fibrillation for which she is using oral anticoagulant esnocomerol, 2 milligrams and 3 milligrams a day, they alternate day, and she is on regular follow-up. She stays at Nalgonda, which is about 100-120 kilometers away from Hyderabad, and just is a routine practice of monitoring the INR over phone. She messages or calls me once in a month, checks the PT-INR at her local diagnostic center and tells me about the dosage, and we adjust the or suggest the dosing that she needs to take. So this time she calls me that her INR is 6.5. There is no recent change of any medication, no addition of drugs, no significant change in the dietary pattern, but INR is 6.5. She denies having any bleeding manifestations, no ecchymotic patches or anything, and she is completely asymptomatic. So this case, who is far away from the your workplace, about 120 kilometers away from the city, and in a somewhat two-tier town. How do you manage this patient? What would you suggest?
So, Praneeth, whenever I look at high INR in these kind of subsets, I always ask myself two questions. One is the risk of spontaneous bleeding, and secondly, the background thrombotic risk that a person has. Now, I don't have a science to back up, but most of the time, my typical thought process is that when INR is less than 5, then the risk of spontaneous bleeding is very low. When the INR is between 5 to 10, and of course these are man-made numbers, human body doesn't work like that, but if the INR is between 5 to 10, then their spontaneous bleeding risk is slightly high that we should do something about. When it is more than 10, then I think the risk of bleeding certainly becomes very high, and that requires kind of an urgent assessment. So, and of course, that also needs to be taken into account what the baseline platelets are, and if there is any other coagulation disorders and all this. So for the sake of discussion, I'm assuming that those things are all right, that she doesn't have thrombocytopenia, she's not anemic, and those kind of things. Then
Yes.
the background thrombotic risk we're talking about, and the case that you describe, a patient with a mechanical mitral valve, which is certainly at a high risk of thrombosis, and on the top of it, having atrial fibrillation, that also puts at a higher risk. So I have a patient with a high thrombotic risk, and intermediate to low spontaneous bleeding risk. This is a patient who does not have any active bleed right now. So, and she lives in Nalgonda, which is quite far from here. So the few things that I will do, first of all, I think this kind of cases can be very well managed at home, in my opinion. I don't think they need to urgently go to the hospital to do something. There is no necessity to do a very rapid reversal of this coagulopathy. In these patients, their INR can be very slowly brought it down. And I typically, in these kind of patients who have got high thrombotic risk, I do not overreact to the point where I tell them to stop anticoagulant. I simply just reduce their dose and see how they do. I tend to stop anticoagulant when their INR is on the higher range, like 10 or so. But if they are 6, 7, particularly with high thrombotic risk, then I don't stop their anticoagulant. So in this particular patient, she's taking 2 milligrams and 3 milligrams of acetrom on alternate day. I will calculate what her weekly acetrom dosing is. And because her INR is about 6, I would try to reduce it by at least, I would try to reduce the anticoagulant dosing by at least 30-40%. So if, let's say, she takes approximately 15 milligrams per week of acetrom, I will reduce it to maybe somewhere around 9 to 10 milligrams per week, and I will tell her to use it accordingly. So in this particular case, I will tell her to take 2 and 1 milligrams on an alternate day, maybe 1 milligrams for the next 2 days, and then do 2 and 1 alternate. That will give her a weekly dose of around 9 to 10 milligrams per week, which will be about 30-35% less than what she's currently taking. And my hope is over the next few days that INR will slowly bring down to maybe somewhere around 3 to 4. And at that time, I can further adjust acetrom. If she's taking antiplatelets at this time, like ecosprin or something, which many of the patients they have prescribed a low dose ecosprin. Till the time their INR is high, I tell them to hold the antiplatelet agent and then go for it. Now, just to give you a little bit of deviation, if this patient was not a high thrombotic risk, maybe just an atrial fibrillation with a low CHAD score and no other high thrombotic risk, then I would go a little bit more aggressive. There I would probably stop acetrom, let the INR fall back to a more acceptable range and then restart, because in that case, even if she stays in a non-therapeutic range for a few days, I wouldn't mind as much as in this particular case where she has got a mechanical mitral valve and atrial fibrillation. So that is overall my take on these kind of patients, and we'll be very happy to see what others think, how they proceed with these cases.
Yeah, so before I move on, when would you like to repeat the PTINR test repeated again after you
So
made these
if
changes?
Right. So when I only make changes with the dosing adjustment, then I wait for at least 72 hours. So I typically tell them to do it after 72 hours, so day 3.
Right, right. Thank you. Yeah. So I agree with most of you, most of the thing that you said. We'll see. Anyone else has any other comments on this? Do they agree or do they have any difference in opinion? I'll take comments from Dr. Srinivas Raju. Sir, do you have any other opinion or do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Anup has just said, but I think it's still worthwhile doing an LFT on this patient because we still don't know why her INR has increased in spite of having no change in any medications.
Okay, okay, sir. Sai Vittal, sir, do you have anything else to add upon? Sai Vittal, sir, I'm unmuting you. Yeah, sorry. I can't.
Yeah,
Yes,
now I
yes,
think you're
sir.
getting. Actually, today we learned some new things actually from Dr. Anup Agarwal. The first thing is usually we were in a hospital are always applied after a INR of 4 or 4.5. And we try, because we've been safer side, we want actually to do INR We ask the patient to take rest, not to go out to routine activities, and inform another member of the family that to be on caution for 3 or 4 days. We repeat usually after 48 hours. And then if it is coming at least at 3 or so, at least 4, we are not afraid. Somewhere about 3 or 3.5 it comes, we are quite satisfied. We reduce the treatment. Or sometimes the very high INR we get, we skip couple of doses of a couple of days, we skip the oral anticoagulant and stop echospray. That's the first thing what we do. Simultaneously, we do a platelet count along with the. We did not do so far. I did not even think of LFT. Now I am learning that it's one of the things that metabolites. And that's how we do that. Actually, 5 years, as I have said, till 5 there is a reassurance ourselves. After 5, we are a bit take to caution. This is what we do.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So, moving forward, as we all know, the test PT with INR, the INR value, which is the important test based on which we make our clinical decisions of changing the drug dosages or admission or whatnot. And this test being very important test, we have with us Dr. Shanti Naidu, who is the head of the Department of Laboratory Medicine here at Care Hospital. So, ma'am, I would like to know about your inputs about these PTINR tests. We get, or at least I get a bit uncomfortable trying to get or interpret the reports which are done in some of those labs which do not look so-called NABL certified or whatever we call it, and how much reliable we should, how much are these tests reliable, and how much can we account and make our decision making, and any tips or tricks on how to interpret these investigations when they come from labs which are not that reputed. What are your thoughts on these things, ma'am?
Thank you, Pranit. What I would like to say is the first thing we tell the patient, whether they are regular patients or are new patients, please monitor yourself in the same lab all the time. Once in a way, you can cross-check with another lab if there is a feeling from the clinician that there is some discrepancy. Now, what happens is the material we use in all the labs is highly variable. The source of the prothrombin time test material, that is the thromboplastin, which we use in the test for the clotting, is from different sources. It can be bovine, it can be porcine, it can be from any other source, human, etc., etc. And that is why all these reagents standardize themselves to the WHO standard before they come into the commercial market. That is why on the bottles or on the material, there is something that is defined as International Sensitivity Index. That means you have a traceability to the original material that is there, which the commercial people use to market their material. Unless this international ISI is there, you cannot use this. And this varies from lot to lot. Now, what happens if the laboratory does not have a proper understanding? Then they don't tend to change this ISI, which is needed in the calculation of the INR every time a lot changes. So there are technical aspects which are very important. So I would personally never advise a patient to go to a smaller lab. One thing, these material is bottled in 2 ml, 4 ml, 5 ml. Now, in a hospital like ours or our peer groups, what would happen? The consumption of the reagent would be very high. Though the company says it is stable for 5 days, 7 days, or whatever shelf life they give it, if you do not store it properly, and you tend to do 2 tests per week and keep it for some 1 month, the reagent deteriorates. And this will be shown in the report. So I would personally advise that before a clinician asks an individual to do a test, that he knows where the test is being done. There will be some feedback from wherever you may be sending your test on your past experience. Now, people who are in the outreach, I really understand that they have a difficulty. But what they should do is, it should be mandatory that at least once a month they go to the nearest higher level lab and then get it done and cross-checked. Now, if you keep changing labs at every turn or every month or once in 3 months, whatever it is, there are bound to be changes. Now, having said all these technical aspects, there is something which is very important, that is calibration of the centrifuges. You need not be an NABL lab, but you can have your quality performances in very good place. So if the quality performances of how you make your plasma, we use platelet per plasma, the speed of centrifugation, etc., is very important. Now, when an individual comes to us, we always request the clinician or the lab phlebotomist, please find out how much dose that individual is taking. In the beginning of our careers, when we used to ask this, the patients used to say, why do you want to know? Are you going to give me an INR or a result according to what I take? That is not the issue. The issue for an experienced lab person is if you are saying that you are taking only 2 milligrams and you are showing an INR of 6 or 7, our immediate reaction, our knee-jerk reaction is to repeat the test, first on the sample that we already have, or take a fresh sample and repeat, because these technical issues are very big. Now, having come to an INR which is more than 8 or 9, any INR that is more than 4 or 5 is a critical alert for us. So immediately it is told to the concerned consultant or their secretaries or their residents, whatever it may be. This is a must for every lab. You can have a cutoff INR 4 as critical or 5 as critical, whatever the place you're working in has decided. Now, if you have an INR which is 8 or 9, a lot of our patients come in at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening. They give a sample and they go home. The lab runs around trying to find out how to intimate this patient that your INR is very high. You please come back for a repeat sample. Any sample after 7 or 8, ideally, our practice is that it should be rechecked. I agree, if they are far away, it is a problem. But if they are within the city limits or in the radius of a very good lab, it is always advisable to get it done. My other point is, tell the patient to keep an uniformity of time. They have taken a drug at 4 o'clock, get it done the next morning at 9. Or if they're taking it in the morning, but let this be very specific at every turn. These are the few points I have.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Equally, I have one more question regarding the same thing. There are few labs who do the so-called genetic testing, trying to look at the genetic mutations which can vary the metabolism of these things. And I also hear they tell what is the probable dose which is appropriate for that patient based on the testing. Then, do you have any idea on that? Can you share some thoughts?
Yes, we have also given our samples for this testing to, we have outsourced to see. But I really believe clinicians are not yet adapted to that, to see that and change the dose. Even though there are big centers in the country which have done this study, I am yet to see clinicians who change their dose according to what that report is. And it is not something that is followed in India as mandatory, but I am told that in some European countries and in the US, it is mandatory that they get this test done and the dose is adjusted. But in my experience, we have these reports of many individuals, but I really don't think a clinician looks at them or adjusts the dose according to that. This is my personal experience.
Thank you, ma'am. Perfect. That answers my question. So we'll move on. We'll try to take some opinions from others about what they think about this patient and any other thoughts on this. So we have Dr. Chandramukhi with us. Ma'am, I'll briefly tell you about this patient, and I want your thoughts on this patient. How would you manage this patient? This is a 65-year-old lady, chronic rheumatic heart disease, post mitral valve replacement with mechanical valve, and also has atrial fibrillation. On 2 and 3 milligrams of azithromycin alternate days, regular monitoring of PTINR at the nearby diagnostic center. INR comes as 6.5. What would you do? What would you suggest to the patient? Come to Hyderabad to get admitted, or come get admitted in hospital, manage at home, stop azithrom, or what would you suggest to this patient?
So first, I would like to ask the patient whether there are any signs of very high INR, like any ecchymotic patches or any bleeding or like that. If there is there are no signs like ecchymotic patches or this bleeding, but still, as Madam said, if it is possible, we will recheck the PT INR. But still, if still it is on the higher side, then I will tell the patient to stop the dosage of azithrom for 2 days and then restart on the 3rd day with less dosage. As you said, it was 2 and 3 mg alternate days. I will restart it with 2 mg daily.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Anup, your hand is up. You have anything to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to add about that genetic testing. So 4 years ago, I believe I was, and if there is a recent data, I don't know. 3-4 years ago, during my morning commute to the hospital, I was listening to a podcast, and at that time, this genotype versus phenotype driven warfarin dosing study, which was a large study that was published, and that was no different in terms of the percentage time where patients remain in therapeutic INR when you dose adjust warfarin based upon genotypical profile versus phenotypical. And essentially phenotypical means INR driven versus genotypical means genetic assessment. So in the last 3-4 years, if there is some new data, I'm not aware of that, but it was my learning from that time that I never embarked upon genetic testing mediated warfarin dosing. And at least in the centers which I was trained, we never used to do that. We used to have warfarin clinics who would manage, but particularly on INR basis, not on the genetics. So I thought I'll just share this because we were discussing that. Thank you. That's all.
All right. Thanks. One more question which keeps running in my mind whenever we talk about using oral anticoagulants, about the timing of the drug that we give. Now that Madam brought about the issue of taking the tablet and getting the test done, we all prescribe azithrom or warfarin to be taken in the evening between around 5 or 6. I believe probably it's all about timing to make it known that this is the drug which is taken at 5 o'clock is something like an oral anticoagulant. That is what I believe. Is there any other reason that I don't know? Anyone can share their thoughts on that? That we prescribe oral anticoagulants at 5 o'clock only so that we can remember that someone who has taken this tablet, it is oral anticoagulant. Someone who says we took white injection, it is penicillin. Is it the same logic that it applies, or any other reason that I don't know? If anyone can share their thoughts on this. Anup, what do you think on this?
Yeah, so early on, I used to think that you prescribe medicine at 6 o'clock and then next day morning when you get the INR, so it's kind of that time phase. But over the time, what I also learned is that the INR response to drug is a delayed response. Typically, it's about 48 hours. So it probably wouldn't matter at what time you're taking. So I agree with you. One is to spot. And the other thing also is that you book that 6 p.m. time for the medicine only. And that kind of, in my opinion, improves the compliance a little bit, where patient knows that my 6 p.m. time is booked for warfarin. So there is no way the patient is going to miss that. I think
Anup, can I add something on this?
Yes, sir, please.
Number one, the reason why the patient is asked to take the drug after 5 p.m. is they get the test done in the morning. And they are also told until the INR value is available that day, you don't take the tablet that day. That allows us time to deal with the unusually high INR as Dr. Shantanayadu pointed out. The second issue is that's convenient. And they are told specifically not to take the drug on that day when you have given the INR test for it and until they get the value and get okay for it. And secondly, the laboratories that genetic testing, when our experience was also dismal. The name of the laboratory is Reliance. It was least reliable actually, and we stopped doing that. Genetic testing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Pranit, I have a sort of opinion.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. John, sir.
Yeah, another reason is that because, as you said rightly, because the action of the drug takes about 2 to 3 hours, and the peak dose is about maybe 5 to 6 hours after the medicine is ingested. Now, what that happens is that by the time the patient is waking up, now one of the dangerous effects of acetron is an intracerebral bleed. We know that. So if the medicine is taken maybe in the afternoon and the peak effect happens at night, nobody will be aware if the patient goes into some kind of a complication. So this is also one of the reasons given, where if it is taken little later at 6, the peak effect being maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, the chance of a major bleed not being sort of picked up is little low. This has to do with a little bit of the pharmacokinetics of the drug. So this is also one of the reasons that has been given, that if the peak effect is early morning, there will be a chance for detection, rather than if the peak effect is maybe early in the night and then the whole night patient is possibly having a kind of a complication and nobody detects it. So that is also, I think, one of the reasons that for many decades it has been given late in the evening.
Okay, sir. Srinivas, sir, your mic is on. You have anything to share, sir?
No, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Sure, sir. I saw Pawan sir having your hand risen. Sir, you have anything to say, Pawan sir?
Yeah, nothing. I think Dr. Somraj sir has explained the same thing. I was talking about the timing of the warfarin was supposed to. Basically, like sir said, yeah, you give it based on the dose. You take the INR test in the morning, and then that is the most common reason for which it is prescribed in the evening.
Sure, sure. Thank you, sir. This patient apparently is not having any bleeding manifestations. Just to continue the discussion about these patients who have bleeding manifestations when we get them into admitted, I think we believe we classify them into minor and major bleeding manifestations and warranting an admission. How do we approach? What should be the line of management? Pawan sir, I would like to take your opinion on managing these patients in an hospital based on the INR. How do you approach? Like when we talk about giving vitamin K oral versus IV, or when we talk about giving other drugs, how do we approach these patients when they have bleeding manifestations? Can you share some thoughts, sir?
Yeah, so we have different ways. I mean, one is the fresh frozen plasma. The other thing is PCC. So the other thing is vitamin K. So we have 3 options to go in, which are available to us, especially when we're talking about warfarin. Now, naturally bleeding, when there is an active bleeding, we would tend to correct with FFP because that is easily available. Vitamin K we tend not to give because it takes more time for the re-initiation of warfarin and for it to act again. So we tend not to give vitamin K unless it's very high in, and even with the plasma, if things are not coming down. So we tend to see if usually if the INR is above 9, we tend to give plasma and some vitamin K. If the INR is between somewhere 6, 7 above, giving 2 units of FFP or 3 units of FFP randomly. But there are always issues because what is the underlying cause for which actually the patient is on warfarin? How thrombogenic is the problem? How much you want to correct it to? Those are the issues. We don't want to overcorrect it, get it down less than 2. And where is the bleeding? That is also important. It's an IC bleed. We tend to correct it faster rate. If it is a bleed somewhere like in a gut, we tend to go a little slow on that. So depending upon the severity of bleed, site of the bleed, and how life-threatening is the bleed, the dose and the other things of plasma will vary. We also have PCC now in India. It comes from Bharat Serums, gets it. It's available as Octaplex. It comes as 500 units. So, but the cost is around 35,000 for 500 units. Of course, if you look at the ICU charges for a plasma, they're around 3,000 to 4,000 per plasma bag. So if you're giving 6 plasma, it will come to around almost 20,000. So these are the things. Again, volume load. If you want to limit the volume load, and you don't, you are suspicion or you are having some sort of an issue with the patient having really bad lungs and trolley is an issue that you want to avoid. PCC is something that you can think. It's a prothrombin complex concentrate PCC that you can give. But again, in a country like India, so that is something we always have to look into before we give this. And yeah, LFT, other things also need to be looked into, platelet counts and other things. If there is any other associated thing that is also causing worsening of the bleeding, that also need to be addressed.
Sure, sir. So you said the prothrombin complex concentrates are available in India, and how easy is it for us to acquire, sir? Is it difficult or is it available?
Within 1 hour. Within 1 hour, our pharmacy can arrange it.
Okay, nice to know that. Yeah, one of the questions in chat box is asymptomatic high INR, when to admit. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Somraju sir to share his thoughts. Sir, what should be the threshold of INR when we would suggest the patients to ask them to get admitted, sir?
The one when it's very high anyway, require admission. And not necessarily in ICU, sometimes in the room, because they get into a lot of problems in ICU. And secondly, it also depends upon age of the patient and also comorbidities. That also will be an issue. These are all the issues also, whether you give vitamin K or just wait. The young people with no comorbidity, they relatively tolerate well, and the next day or two usually come back to near normal or normal whatever it is. So in an older individual with comorbidities and other issues, you have to be extremely careful. And another issue I just want to point out is, these are all the patients who are chronically ill and with you. They had a valve replacement or some other issues. They already had multiple admissions for a variety of reasons, and they are chronic oral anticoagulation. The hospitals have to have a separate category of billing, and also the charging that has to be different from the rest of the patients. Then only we can treat these patients properly. A hospital who doesn't have that type of attitude, it should not be willing to treat these patients.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I will read some of the other questions in the chat box. Azithromycin in breastfeeding patient. So, whether patient can be given azithromycin in a breastfeeding patients. Anyone can share this out? Anup, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, so I have no particular problem giving warfarin in breastfeeding female. I think that is absolutely fine. Same thing is for Esitrom as well. Now, I must confess, I don't have that much of experience with Esitrom because, as you know, Esitrom is not available in the United States. There exclusively we use warfarin or the NOL anticoagulants. So, but I don't see a problem. Of course, in pregnant women it's a problem, but in breastfeeding I don't see any particular problem.
Okay, thank you. Next question is metallic mitral valve, no bleeding manifestation. At what INR would prompt to give a vitamin K? Pawan sir, I want to come back to you. When do you think we should give vitamin K for someone who is not having any bleeding manifestation but has high INR?
See, that's the same question again. If you can give 2 FFP and see where they are, if the patient is above 9, let's say, usually the guidelines say anything above 9. Up to 6, fine, you can stop the drug, hold off. 6 to 9, you can observe by adjusting the dose or stopping one dose. Above 9, they recommend correcting it, even if the patient is not bleeding. But then again, once you give 2 FFP and see the response, if you think the patient is actively bleeding or if there's a significant amount of bleeding. In a non-bleeding patient, vitamin K, better not to give, unless you think that even with FFP things are not improving. Like again, the cost issues, everything comes into the picture here. If you're thinking that FFP is also expensive going in, you may give vitamin K. It's very cheap drug. But the only problem with vitamin K is once you give vitamin K, it takes more time for the reinitiation of warfarin and its effect to come into the picture.
All right. And how do we dose this FFP, sir? I hear people deciding about either it is 2 bags, 4 bags, or 6 bags. Is there any formula or a rationale of how much to dose, whether it is asymptomatic high INR versus bleeding versus and all? How do we titrate the dosing of these FFP?
Again, if the patient is actively bleeding, if it's a life-threatening, you may go ahead and give almost 6 units of plasma if the INR is above 9. If it's 6 to 9 and if the patient is still bleeding, let's say 6 to 9, you may think about giving 2 FFP. If it is above 9, a patient is bleeding, give 6 FFP. If you think the patient is above 9, not bleeding, start with 2 FFP and bring it below 6, and then probably adjust the dose. So, if it's a bleeding, non-bleeding is one issue, and whether it is above 6 to 9 or above 9. Those are the things that you need to look at.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'll come back to Dr. Shanti Naidu, madam. Madam, when we do treat these patients for people who have these deranged INR or elevated INR, and we are giving treatment, something like we're giving vitamin K or FFP, how should we send a sample, or what is the timing of getting these investigated, and how do we draw samples or anything so that we don't get again an erroneous value? Any guidelines on that of getting the test repeated again? How do we do that?
So we usually ask 6 to 8 hours after an FFP, because immediately definitely there will be peak values and we may not get the correct value. We will get a low PT reading in seconds, which will be a low INR. So we usually say give it to us at least 6 to 8 hours, because most of the half-lives of these factors will be around that time. Each factor has a different half-life. But I just have a query to Dr. Pawan on this. When you infuse so much of FFP, nobody monitors fibrinogen. And we see very high values of fibrinogen because FFP will contain a lot of fibrinogen. Would you like to give something else other than that where fibrinogen would not go up so high? We see 600, 700, which by itself is thrombogenic. Hello?
Yes,
yeah.
So the basic issue again, that's what I'm saying. See, in the West, it is easy for somebody to give PCCs. In India, expensive. So you have to give some sort of specific factors if you're looking at. Specific factors are again costly in India. So FFP is the cheapest option. Vitamin K is the cheapest option, but again, because of its overcorrection or because of the issue that delay in reinitiation or the action of warfarin to come back in, we tend to go for a faster reversal with a moderate reversal with FFPs. So 2 FFPs should not bring your fibrinogen very high unless there are some situations where we give 6 FFP when the patient is having life-threatening bleeding, either GI or intracranial bleed. That's when we go ahead for 6 FFP. Otherwise, 4 FFP, 2 FFP, 1 FFP, it doesn't usually bring that fibrinogen very high up.
Okay.
And ma'am, when someone is receiving vitamin K, when do you think we should be sending the sample and any other specific precautions to taking the sample or drawing the sample?
We usually advise after 3 injections. That is usually the dose that people give, and usually it is IM. I don't think I have seen many IVs of vitamin K being given, but usually, ideally, it would be after 3 days. But in a situation where a patient is admitted for suspicious bleeding anywhere, then as mentioned, I don't think vitamin K would be ideal. Then you'll have to do it on a daily basis, the PT-INR on a daily basis.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Pranit, yeah. So the
Yes,
actual
sir.
funny part is if you go for guidelines, they all say oral 1 to 2 milligram of vitamin K. So we don't give oral vitamin Ks 1 to 2 mgs. We tend to give IV. In the ICUs, we give IV, especially when somebody is coagulopathy, we don't give IM injections at all. So we give IV. The same preparation is available, which can be given either IM or IV. But unfortunately, people don't understand that we have to give it 1 mg or 2 mg. They tend to give it of 10 mg with an ampoule, 1 ampoule. So that is the problem. So gets a little higher stores of vitamin K going. So 1 mg, 2 mg is sufficient actually, vitamin K. But people give 10 mgs.
Yeah. We don't want to waste the vial, so what all is there in the vial we tend to give
I
it.
don't think it is even 10 rupees or 15 rupees.
Yeah. Yes. So moving forward, I'll read the other questions which are there in chat box. One of the questions is the use of ethamsulate and tranexamic acid in coagulopathy. Probably I'll ask again you, Pawan sir. Probably you can answer it better.
I mean, the coagulopathy of giving these drugs, see, basically, it's a dual statement if you say coagulopathy. Now, if you're thinking about warfarin-induced coagulopathy or acetrom-induced, it is through the factor deficiency, basically 2, 7, 9, 10, which are vitamin K-dependent factors. Now, because the factors are deficient, you give the factors to stop the bleeding. If it's a minimal ooze, mild ooze, and you want to clog the bleeding, you usually give this aminocapric acid or you give tranexamic acid. These are basically antifibrinolytics. In the sense, if there is a clot formation and then there is a breakdown, you want to stop that. But in a general sense of coagulopathy, where the patient has consumption going on because of clot formation and then clot breaking down, there you try to prevent the clot breaking down by giving this. If it's an intracranial bleed, probably it makes some sense in stopping that and not getting down. But other than that, as far as the discussion that we are having here, there is no role for this Tranexa or epsilon aminocapric acid.
Yeah. And just to complete the discussion, the one thing which I remember or I learned regarding this tranexamic acid, which we give for patients who are having bleeding, it's given or it's indicated in any bleeding, but for bleeding per urinary bleeding, this can lead to clot and urinary obstruction behaving like a stone. So that is probably the only indication where we don't give tranexamic acid, and other bleeding sites we probably can safely give tranexamic acid.
Post-thrombolysis. Post-thrombolysis.
Yes. So that is what I remember. And one more question is, what is the role of NOACs in patients with valvular atrial fibrillation in patients with high chance of bleeding? Maybe Anup, you can take this question.
Yeah, so Novavax in valvular AF, if we want to be purist, then they are not approved. There is a recent study, hot off the press, I believe it was published last week, I would say. Patients in atrial fibrillation and bioprosthetic mitral valve, I believe the study drug was rivaroxaban, was proven to be non-inferior to warfarin. Regardless, I think this space of Novak in valvular AF is still up in the air. In the Indian setup, where I think, and I must say this without any fear, that in India, where the scrutiny and the societal litigation is not as much, in terms of that we have more liberty to practice off-the-shelf drugs. I personally think Novak would be okay in patients who have got significant bleeding risk, even if it is a valvular AF. That is just my opinion, because I think it is better than not giving anything. But understanding that data suggests that these drugs are not as good as warfarin in thrombotic prevention, in thrombosis prevention. They certainly will reduce the risk of bleeding. So that is just my take on it. For metallic valves, I will not do it. If anybody got a metallic valve implantation, either in aortic or mitral position, I will not give novel anticoagulant. Guidelines don't support it, and I don't think there is any data. Very early on, Pradaxa tried that data, but they failed quite miserably. So after that, I don't think anybody had the guts to do the study.
Dr. Anup, I'll add something on the metallic valve and Novavax.
Sir.
Continuing on what I said about one of the patients, we did a genetic study because even at 0.5 milligrams of azithromycin or even warfarin, trying the lowest doses, the INRs were shooting high and low, and it was very erratic. He was our patient for the last more than 10 years, and the metallic valve, mitral, and also atrial fibrillation. And then we thought we had no choice other than trying Novak. And she's on this Novak for the last more than 3.5 years. Absolutely no problem. She's doing extremely well.
Yes, sir. I was.
Yes, sir. Praneeth, I think that this is important. That is why we have discussion like these, where we don't just talk about hardcore science and whatever is there, nicely printed on the literature. I think this is a fantastic platform to share such case scenarios. I only wish if when we do stuff like this and we have got good outcome, if we could pool some of these experiences together, and that way at least we'll have for early practice people like us, we'll have a slightly more confidence to go off label and give these drugs. Most of us who do off label and whatever we have got the experience, I think that many of the times it remains with us. So I really wish that more and more people, they would share their off-label experience, and that will give us more confidence to use this.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing that experience. I was about to ask you the same thing, and you shared the experience. Thank you for that. There is one more question popped up in the chat box. Is there any rationale to shift to warfarin from azithromycin if INR is high? I don't think about it. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Chandramukhi. Madam, what do you think about this thing, changing from azithromycin to warfarin because INR is high?
I don't think that it will help in like changing from azithromycin to warfarin.
Dr. Praneeth, I'll add here.
Yes, sir.
Unlike azithromycin, warfarin has, we will be able to give even 0.5 milligrams or 2.5, etc. easily they're available in those doses, but
Yes.
not acetylone. That's the reason why sometimes it's convenient to give warfarin.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. But do you think the INR range is going to change, sir? Other than the ease of administration, pharmacokinetics, is it going to change? And will it
They are similar drugs, except that you have the convenience of lowest doses giving possible, and the 0.5 milligram extra we want to give. Those wide variety of range of tablets are available in warfarin, and acetylone I now is available as 1 milligram. Earlier it was not available.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, so in my short 3-year experience here, I have switched acetylone to warfarin at least in 2 patients that I can recollect, and the reasoning being what Dr. Somaraju sir said, that their INR was so high on 1 milligram of acetylone, it was easier for me to just switch to warfarin and give 1 and 0.5 milligrams, purely based upon that rationale, nothing else.
I think acetylone is now available with 0.5 milligrams as well, but I have zero experience in prescribing 0.5. But yes, point taken. Ease of administration.
And
I-
Pranit, I believe the half-life is also different for acetylone and warfarin. I think for warfarin it's 36 hours, so it provides a little more stability than acetylone.
Okay, I didn't know that. So another question is about green vegetables and warfarin. Absolute no or a fixed amount every day is okay. This is again one of the common questions in OPD practice. Probably I'll ask Dr. Somraju sir for his take on this, sir. Sir, what would you suggest patients taking green vegetables on this? Absolute no, or can they take fixed dose?
After a ward replacement, the surgeons tell the patients not to touch green vegetables at all. That's wrong. And they must take the constant amount, not wide variability in their diet. They take a constant amount of diet, whatever diet they take, including green vegetables, etc. And the doses can be adjusted in such a way that they are constant. It doesn't change. Don't advise patients not to touch vegetables, green vegetables, etc. And the dosages of anticoagulant have to be adjusted by their diet. And to tell patients not to touch vegetables is putting them into variety of problems.
Yes. Yes, sir. Accepted. Even I won't suggest not taking an absolute no. Some of the things that I suggest to my patients or my way of practicing is I ask them to think as if it's like a mess or a canteen where you have a fixed schedule. Like if you want to have leafy vegetables or other vitamin K food, try to have a day. Something like if it's a Monday, every Monday you should be taking a green leafy vegetables at that particular time, and Tuesday is some schedule, Wednesday is some schedule, and try to have a fixed food items in your list like a mess or a canteen will have, and so that you don't deny yourself of the favorite foods that you want to eat and still don't deprive of all those things. So maintain a fixed schedule is what I would suggest my patients.
Yeah, in a lighter vein, Ram Subramaniam and some of his colleagues, they refused to see the patient if they had green vegetables.
Thank you for sharing that, sir. I think we are almost 8:30.
I have one last question. I have one last question to ask. And ma'am, this question is directed to Shanti Naidu, ma'am, but anybody, please share your opinion as well. What I was told, and as a training, I never verified it myself, and I don't know if there is a good way to verify, so there's a good platform to ask. Occasionally, we have patients who are bleeding and whose INR is high, but not more than 2. Their INR is, let's say, 1.8, 1.9, something like that, and they have bleeding. And we want to correct that INR. In a situation where not like a metallic valve or whatnot, where there is no major thrombotic issue. I was told that FFP is not very effective when INR is that low at 1.8, 1.9. And there, the only thing you can resort to is vitamin K, but that takes a long time. In desperate measure, we do give FFP, but whether that affects, whether that helps or not, I don't know. So I just wanted to seek people's opinion, maybe start with Dr. Shanti Naidu in terms of what do you think role of FFP in these patients?
Actually, I would not be able to answer that question accurately, but I think the general practice is to give FFP. That is the general practice. I don't think when a patient has a bleed, like Dr. Pawan has mentioned earlier, that people would resort to a vitamin K injection. No, never. Once there is a clinical bleed, it's an immediate reaction to give FFP, whether it is 1 or 2, whatever it may be. I think they want to stop the bleeding. I don't think anybody would resort to vitamin K at that time. Dr. Pawan?
Yeah, Pawan sir, if you could answer that. Of course, the best answer here will be PC, but of course, as Pawan sir already told multiple times that, it is not often the most practical way of doing it. So sir, INR of 1.8 active bleed, how would you handle?
No, I should first of all find out whether the bleed is because of coagulopathy from factor deficiency or from thrombocytopenia. That is a problem. So we need to understand some of them have uremia, there may be uremic bleeds, some of them have other problems. You have a CRS guy coming in with urea going up. So you have to understand what is the real cause. But unfortunately, we don't resort to all those tests. We don't do something like a TEG to establish. We give away because it's easy to do, giving something away rather than evaluating it. Because again, the expense of doing investigation, and ultimately the question will be, what will you do even if you see something like other factor deficiencies or fibrinogen deficiency? You still end up giving FFP because it's easily available. It's off the shelf. You come and give it up. So we tend to give off FFP of that reason. But if you have a TEG, let's say, if you exactly want to know what is the cause of the bleed, doing a TEG will give you a clear picture of whether it is a fibrin deficiency issue, or if you are doing, is it because of, otherwise you can ask Shanti Naidu madam to get a look at the APTT. We always only look at INR, look at APTT, look at fibrinogen level, look at other stuff, look at the platelet count, and look at the thrombin time. All these things will also help you whether there is another reason for the bleeding. But again, if it is a thrombin bleed, you still give FFP. If it's fibrinogen low, you still give FFP. So you end up ultimately giving FFP for a whole lot of other reasons.
Dr. Anup, can I add something here? In therapeutic and subtherapeutic doses of INR,
Yes,
if somebody has a bleeding, they have an underlying disorder. And depending upon the age group, the most important source you have to look for is gastrointestinal malignancy or peptic ulcer or something similar. So actually, that some of the advantages of aspirin or similar drugs and also anticoagulants, they bring out the diagnosis of cancer earliest. And this may be, that should be kept in mind. Therapeutic and subtherapeutic doses, somebody bleeds, and investigate them enough so that you rule out those conditions.
Yeah.
Sir, I cannot agree more. In a funny way, I used to say what my seniors used to say, and I just copied it, that dual antiplatelet is a stress test for your GI malignancy. So basically, you give it to them and they will reveal whether they have got a malignancy or not. So I cannot agree more. Yeah.
And there is one more thing about this vitamin K dependent, 2,7. Apart from that, we forget the von Willebrand factor is also affected here with warfarin. So that is something we tend to forget in majority of the situations. So that can also be the cause for bleeding in within INR being normal. Again, right, back to you, Fred.
All right. So I think we are 8:35. I think we had a good discussion. As we are running short of time, we'll try to close the session. Before we close, Shanti Naidu madam, I think you are attending the huddle second time. What do you think? How do you any comments on this session? Any constructive criticism so that we can make it better?
I learn.
Before you talk, good evening.
Sir, good evening, sir. Sir, I said good evening right in the beginning when I saw your name.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pawan, I always think that laboratory people, the more they interact with clinicians, their science becomes better. Their understanding is very different to what a clinician would think. And I think I have learned in all my years of experience, straight from Nizam's interaction with clinicians participating in such programs, I obviously learn a lot. And I think it takes a lot to manage such events in the evening and see that people attend. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sandy,
Sir?
remember we wanted to initiate a program. Sorry, Anup, I will just add this here.
Sure,
We
sure.
want to initiate a program where the laboratory scientists and microbiologists and then the biochemists and also radiologists also take a round together and then also independently, just like us, in the wards today. That is the nature of medicine we are practicing. That will improve a lot of things.
Yes. There has to be crosstalk all the time between the laboratory and the clinician. We learn from each other.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. This is one of the habits which I learned from my stay in Nizams, and I'm really proud that I learned this habit. Yes, I can't agree more than that. That interaction with lab medicine and clinician is definitely very important. Pawan sir, what is your thoughts on the huddle and any constructive criticism where we can make it better?
I mean, it's a great platform for everybody to for me, getting to know some other cardiology perspectives on few things is always something I'll gain on. Likewise, we all like Shanti Naidu madam said, bringing other different specialties, whom we don't usually do a clinical round. Like Somaraju said, it is the best thing if we can get a microbiologist, if we have a pathologist, if we have a biochemist, and a radiologist. If we can, everybody can join us in a grand round. That tells us a lot of things, and we can discuss in a proper way. But unfortunately, we don't have that luxury of manpower to do everything in together. But these are the platforms I think that will serve us better. And unfortunately, this class, this today's session, we couldn't discuss much about the NOAC reversions. But maybe part 2.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Anup, your final comments about today's session?
Yeah, I think sessions like these are very important because this topic is very common to all of us, and we all have evolved practicing in our own way and sharing what we think, how we react. I think that is very important. One thing that I mentioned earlier, I'm mentioning it again. I wish we had a platform where we could discuss our off-label practices without any fear of, somebody judging or telling us the otherwise or whatnot. Because once we have like a repository of how we practice with our off-label, certainly from there we will get some signal in terms of what is probably a better practice versus what doesn't work as much. And I wish we had a kind of a platform like this where we could save all those off-label data set and analyze it slightly better. Maybe one of us can work on it or find an idea or something. But on the huddle, we'll keep talking those off-label things and keep getting our practice pattern evolved. So good session overall.
Yeah, thanks, Anup. So before I close, a small reminder that all our huddle sessions are recorded and they are published in YouTube and podcast for anyone to access. And equally, if anyone wants to listen to any of these sessions or previous sessions, they can ping to myself or Anup. We can share the links. And huddle is a session which is hosted every Wednesday, 7:30 to 8:30, and the same link and password work for almost all the sessions. So anyone who finds interesting, please do share to your colleagues as well. And we want to learn by interacting with others and other specialties, and overall help in making a better practice. With that, I thank everyone for your active participation, and we'll see you again in the next huddle. Thank you all. Good evening.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Bye.